Encourage you to turn your Bibles to Romans chapter 9. Or if you didn't bring a Bible, you probably find one near you somewhere. If you follow along with us, that'd be great. I was thinking that some things that people do are just so awful, so terrible, that I think all of us would agree that it's evil. Some of the things going on in our world today, or things that we've read about in history, they're just so terrible that all of us would say, that's just so wicked, that we would all agree that that's something that no Christian would want to be a part of. I see people who would beat a child or leave a child without food and allow them to starve to death. You read of people who would take an animal, a puppy or another animal, and torture them. And you think, how could anyone do something like that? Or recently, a person taking a van, and it's happened several times in the last few months, where just run through a crowd of people and just kill innocent people. Drug pushers who admit openly targeting kids. People who could take a bomb and bring it into a crowded marketplace and just explode it and kill people who had no idea what was coming. Some of these things are so hideous and so wicked. We would think anybody that would think it's okay, there's something wrong with them. Anybody that wouldn't think that's bad, then that person has a problem. I mean, could you picture Christians doing any of those things? Could you see somebody who loves God who would commit an act like that? And that brings us to Romans chapter 12, our verse to underline this morning. And I encourage you to mark it or circle it or put a star by it. Now, if you can't do that, it's okay. My father told me, he said, I just can't do that. I just grew up underlining scriptures and marking them, but some people just never did that. But if you're all right doing it, mark it in some way, Romans chapter 12 and verse 9. Your translation may vary slightly, but the message is going to be similar regardless of what version you might be using. Paul said in Romans chapter 12 and verse 9, abhor what is evil and cling to what is good. Some translations will say, hate what is evil and cleave to or hold fast to what is good. Now, I believe that this is the kind of verse that will radically change our lives, not just a little bit. I mean, there are some things that we study that make us feel better, that encourage us, that strengthen us, or some of them that might help us to make sure we're believing the right thing. But this particular verse, I think if we can really get a hold of it, our life will never be the same. It is life-changing because it's not enough just to know a Bible verse. You might know a lot of Bible verses. And now, we start there. We have to know it first. But then we got to believe it. But it's not enough just to believe a Bible verse. There are a lot of Bible verses that I grew up knowing and believing, but they didn't affect me. They didn't change me. They didn't make me a different person. They didn't turn my life around. I think the only way that happens is if we know it and we believe it, and then we put it into our lives. We live it. We let it become a part of us. We let it change us. We absorb it to the point that our life changes and it's different. And I think this is the kind of verse that if you just know it, or if you just believe it, you'll leave here the same as when you came. It's only if we can take this verse and really understand it and say, now, I want to live this. I want this to be me. That you'll find this verse will make a big difference in your life. Abhor what is evil. Hate what is evil. What kind of evil is Paul talking about? You think about the things we talked about at the beginning, where a person would neglect and not feed a child, or would torture an animal, or would be a mass murderer. You think that's what Paul's describing here? Do you think the Christians at Rome had a problem with going around just killing anybody they came across? Do you think they were rapists? Do you think they were evil, wicked people that would just target and hurt people with hideous criminal acts? I don't think so. I think he's talking about evil that's not just that kind of evil. The word abhor, which is not a word we hear very often, but that word means to utterly detest. Where something is just despicable, it's detestable to us. It means to have a horror of. That it would just frighten us, that we would see something and we would be horrified by it. To literally, to hate it. In some translations, translate it, hate what is evil. Now, I've met some families, and I respect this, who will not allow the H word to be said in their family. We don't use the word hate. We don't talk about it. We don't describe it. I get it. I understand it. I know that's a word that we sometimes use as a word to hurt people. And we say it viciously to attack people. But it is a biblical word if we use it correctly. If we understand. I've had people come and talk to me, and I even knew a preacher one time who was told when he went somewhere to start preaching that, the sermons that you are limited to are sermons about God's grace, His goodness, His love, His kindness, His compassion, sermons about hope and forgiveness and salvation and mercy, and that's it. We don't want to hear about any bad stuff. We just want you to preach about things that are positive and upbeat and encouraging. Now, all those things are true. God is all of that. God is loving and kind and merciful and gracious. God is forgiving. And all of those things are God. And I tell you what, I enjoy preaching about those kind of things. I love to talk about God's goodness and His kindness because God is an amazing God. But the same Bible that talks about all those things, the same Bible says to hate what's sin, to hate what is evil, and hang on and cling to what is good. Some people have a hard time thinking of God as a God of hate. But you realize that God is not only a God of love. The Bible depicts God as a God of hate. Now, He loves every one of us, but He hates sin. And in Proverbs, just as one example, in Proverbs chapter 6, there are 7 things that God hates, and He describes them. And they're all sinful behaviors, sinful actions. God hates sin. It goes against the very nature of God, who is good and kind. And sin is the opposite. And God hates sin. He wants us to hate sin. He's calling on us here to abhor, to detest, to be horrified of sin. Now, there are some things that I think we're horrified of. I don't know about you, but probably all of us can think of something in our lives that terrifies us, that we just can't stand. It's detestable. I can remember a time when I felt that way about heights. And I mean, you put me up on something tall, and we were up on our roof this past week. Some shingles were damaged, and I thought, yeah, we can fix this. And then I got up there, man, this roof is so steep and so high up. I said, I think I want to pay somebody to do this. If I tied myself off and I hung on for dear life, I know I could fix it. But I just don't like heights. They're scary to me. Now, I've gotten better with it. I've even parachuted. I've learned to kind of deal with some of those fears that I have, but there are still things. If I go to an amusement park, I don't want to ride on a ride that's going to spin me all around because I'll be sick. And I'm horrified at the thought. I detest it. Luann grew up that way with darkness. The darkness it was scary to her. It was something that she hated. And again, she's worked on that and she's improved there. But probably in your life, there's something that you detest. It maybe is snakes, or maybe it's spiders, or maybe it's being in an enclosed, confined area. But all of us have something that when we think about that, we get horrified about it. And we just can't stand to think about doing it. Well, that's what God is saying. That's how I want you to feel about sin. I want you to abhor sin. I want you to detest it. I want it to make your blood boil. I want you to be horrified by it. One translation translates it, shrinking from sin. I think that's an interesting phrase. Shrinking from sin. And I picture in that one a spider that gets close to a fire. And you watch that spider just shrink away from it. It just doesn't want to be anywhere near. And I think that's what I need to do when I get close to sin. When I start getting close to sin, I need to be horrified. I need to jump back and shrink away from it. I hear people say, well, about something bad, yeah, I don't like that. You see somebody doing something wrong, maybe being mean or bullying or being ugly to somebody, and they say, oh, I don't like that. God doesn't tell us not to like it. You see something on TV and you think, yeah, I'm not real big on that. I don't really care for that. He's not saying don't care for it or don't like it. He's saying to hate it. Not just to have a slight displeasure in it, but to detest it, to abhor it, to hate it. What is it we're supposed to hate? Just the really bad stuff? Just the real evil sin? What is sin? 1 John chapter 3 and verse 4 says that sin is the transgression of the law. Sin is when I transgress or go against God's law. So if God says something and He says, don't do that, if I go against that and I do it, then I am sinning. I am breaking, transgressing the law. Or if God says, here's something I want you to do, and I say, I don't want to do that, I'm not going to do that, I am transgressing or going against the law. So anything in my life, or anything that is around me that goes against what God says, if I choose to disobey God, God says that's sin, and I need to hate that. I need to abhor that. I need to detest it. It's not just the big sins like murder, and people who would go and rob a bank, and people who would torture an animal, or people who would destroy the life of an innocent person. All sins. Every sin that violates God's law is something that I need to hate. You say, well, it's just a little lie. It wasn't really anything real big. I just didn't really tell the truth. It's sin. Well, I didn't actually lie. I just deceived somebody a little bit. God says, that's sin. You need to hate it. I look at our language. And I'll give you a couple of examples. And we'll try to be a little computer savvy with a couple of these. The Bible says not to use God's name in vain. And yet how many times do we hear Christians using God's name, saying God's name, when they're not talking about God, and they just kind of like, well, it's okay. It's not a big deal. It doesn't really matter. And God says, wait a minute, my name matters to me. And by the way, if you're on your phone, or if you're on the computer and you type OMG, that's what you're doing. You're using God's name in vain, because we know what that stands for. And we know when we're typing it, we're not talking to God or about God, but that's just part of our everyday lives. I mean, it's just common talk. Nobody really thinks about it. And sometimes we are foul and we don't even realize we're using foul language. From a relative, I was on Facebook here a couple of months back, and somebody made a joke or something, and they typed in response LMAO, and I know what that stands for. And you know what? You wouldn't say that out loud. You wouldn't use that kind of language, in talking to your parents. But yet we type those kind of things, and we think, it's not a big deal. And God says, wait a minute. If that's something filthy or something foul, why would you do that? Why would we want to do something that would hurt God? We think it's just the big stuff. God doesn't really care about the little things. But if it's sin, it's wrong. And we need to stay away from it. We've gone from a nation that was founded on Christian principles. I mean, I grew up when sin was hated and good was honored and respected. And now we've gone to a nation where sin is a joke. It's laughed at. It's funny. And now that which is good is hated and mocked and ridiculed. I think sin has just become so commonplace that we become numb to it. It's just all around us. People talk that way. People use bad language, so it doesn't even embarrass us anymore. I mean, there was a time when we would have been embarrassed at some stuff that now we don't even think about. It just doesn't even faze us. I think of movies that when I was younger, we'd have walked out of that movie. And now Christians just sit there and laugh and don't even think anything of it. I think of sitcoms that that, there's nudity or there's sexual discussions and content where, we ought to be switching the channel or turning the TV off, but we just sit there and maybe get slightly embarrassed at the most. Most of what is on program TV now, religion is laughed at, it's mocked, it's ridiculed, it's scorned, and we just take it all in. Here we are in the middle of the biggest drug epidemic that this world has ever seen. All around us there's rioting and police being shot and murder, abortion, crime, innocent people being hurt on our streets. There's political corruption. There's violence and stealing, abuse. And our nation is just dying all around us. And sometimes we just don't even give it another thought. I think we got to take our blinders off. And we got to be honest and see what's happening. Now, you may say, oh man, you're just being pessimistic. I'm not a very pessimistic person. People that know me consider me to be pretty upbeat. I'm just being a realist. I'm just telling you that sin has become such a part of our culture that we don't even see it. We don't even recognize it. It's just become everyday life. And in the middle of all that, Paul says, hate what is evil and hold on to what is good. The sad thing is that I'm not just talking about what we see in the world around us, but I see sin creeping into our lives, creeping into the church, creeping into my family, creeping into my life. And things that I don't think twice about now are things that used to bother me and should be troubling us. Our lives have become so materialistic. It's all about the stuff we have and what we own and what we possess. The things that we want to buy. Even among Christians, we hear gossip and there's sexual sin and gay lifestyles. And I look at the way we dress and I think, man, what's going on? We couldn't have dressed that way 50 years ago. You couldn't even have dressed that way in town 50 years ago. And now it's just part of what we are. I mean, the music we listen to, the movies that we watch, the shows that we see. We see more sex, more swearing, more immoral lifestyles, more nudity on TV than what you used to be able to see in a movie theater. And I hear Christians say, it doesn't bother me. That's the scary part. It doesn't bother us. We become so numb to it, it doesn't even bother us anymore. That's the problem. It should bother us. Hate what is evil. I had a Christian tell me, and they were being honest, and we had an honest discussion about it, but they said, what we consider foul language, it shouldn't bother people. It's just part of the way people talk. And there's really nothing wrong with using those kind of words. You can't show me in the Bible where it says don't use the F word or don't use the S word. You can't show me a Bible verse where that word is specifically mentioned. And that's just the way that everybody talks now. And you just got to get used to it. And it's really only wrong for you, but it's not wrong for me. And I've mentioned this in class one time. I would ask two questions. If you were before a judge, maybe appearing for something that you violated a law somewhere, or maybe you're before a judge as a witness in a criminal act of somebody else, and if the judge were to ask you a question, would you answer him with one of those words? Would you use one of those words before the judge? So if you tell me everybody talks that way and it's just the way life is, would you speak to a judge that way? Now, I've had most people say, well, of course not. You'd get in big trouble. And by the way, around here, you get in some serious trouble if you use that kind of language in a courtroom. But let's suppose your answer would be, well, it wouldn't bother me because that's just the way everybody talks. I'll ask the second question. When you pray, would you use that word when you're talking to God? Would you use that same language when you speak to God in prayer? Now, if not, why would it be okay to use it every day if it's not something you would use in prayer? And I think that would be a good thing for every one of us to filter our language. I'm not going to say anything to you. I'm not going to use any language to you that I wouldn't use to God. I'm not going to type anything on my computer that I wouldn't type in a letter to God in my prayer. And I'll tell you what, that would change the way I talk. I won't go anywhere that I wouldn't take God with me. If God wouldn't want to watch that movie, why am I watching it? If He wouldn't go with me. If Jesus wouldn't go and sit down and watch that sitcom with me, then why am I watching it? If we filtered everything with what God would want. You see, God hates sin, and He wants me to hate sin. So if God wouldn't do it, why am I doing it? Why would I talk that way? It's easy to talk about loving God and doing right and God's forgiveness, but we're talking about God hating sin and God wanting me to hate sin like He does. I can remember as a kid when the WWJD was so popular, and bracelets and different things. I remember reading the book that kind of set all that into motion. And I remember the application when I would teach teenage classes, and I would ask them, I'd say, you're sitting there watching that show and you're laughing and you think it's really funny. Would Jesus think that was funny if He was sitting beside you? Would He be laughing? Would He think, oh yeah. Now I think Jesus had a sense of humor. I think there's examples in Scripture that show us that I think Jesus could laugh. And I think He could enjoy life. But would He laugh at that? Would He think that comment was funny? Would He think that story was something to laugh at? Would He walk out of that movie, or would He sit there and watch it with me? Would I get embarrassed at the fact, oh man, Jesus is sitting by me and I'm watching this, I'm listening to this music? Would he sit there and listen to it with me? Could he plug into the songs that I'm playing, and would he feel good about it? Would he think those are helpful and encouraging? Man, so what are we doing? Why do we find ourselves caught up in the world around us as far as sin? I think it's because it just looks so appealing. I mean, if it didn't look good, why would we do it? We wouldn't be tempted if it wasn't appealing. Now, you probably aren't really tempted to go out and mass murder a bunch of people, or beat up on a pet, or torture a child. Why? Because that's not appealing to us. That's not something that would make me feel good. So I'm not going to be tempted to do some of those things. Those don't look that good. It's not a problem. But Satan makes what I want to do, what would appeal to me, what would tempt me. He makes that look good. He's sneaky. Back in the Garden of Eden in Genesis 3:6, when Eve was being tempted by Satan with the fruit, the Bible says it was pleasant to the eyes. Man, it just looked good to her. And I think that's the way sin is. I mean, there's always nice music. There's always flashing lights. It's going to be advertised with some tough macho guy or some beautiful woman. It's going to be appealing. Some of the funniest and best made commercials are some of the alcohol commercials. I mean, they put a lot of money into it. And I catch myself thinking, man, that was clever. That was really well done. I mean, it's always somebody who's really high class or maybe rich or an attractive person. And everybody's sitting around having fun and drinking because Satan wants to make everything look good. He's not going to show you the drunk in the gutter whose life is gone. He's not going to picture the guy who just lost his wife and lost his kids, lost his job, lost everything he owns because what alcoholism did to him. We're not going to see that. He's going to make it look appealing. And yet sin destroys. It's destructive. It enslaves us. I remember back when I was a teenager hearing the fable of the Arab and the camel. And I may have shared this years back, I don't remember. But I remember hearing it as a youngster. And my dad would tell the story of the Arab and his camel were out in the desert, and it started getting really cold at night. The Arab's in his tent nice and warm. The camel's out there cold, freezing, and the camel speaks to the Arab and says, hey, would you mind if I just stuck my head in the tent? It's really cold out here. And the Arab looks at the tent. It looks like there's space there. Sure, put your head in here and warm up a little bit. A little bit later, the Arab hears the camel say, kind sir, I'm still really cold. Could I just put my front feet in to warm up a little bit? And the Arab says, sure, go ahead and do that. And of course, pretty soon it's my back, and then it's my back feet. Next thing you know, the whole camel's inside the tent. And that tent wasn't made for a camel and a person, so it's extremely crowded. And the Arab finally says, well, hey, wait a minute, man, it's really getting crowded in here. There's not enough room. And the camel politely replies, well, if there's not enough room, if it's too crowded, you can leave anytime you want. That's the way sin does. It just sneaks in one foot at a time. Not all at once, not overwhelming, just do a little of this, take a little of this, talk a little bit like this. And the next thing you know, our life is consumed and saturated. Sin kills. It's deadly. I don't think we'll ever learn to hate sin, to detest sin, until we realize the ruin that it causes, the lives that are destroyed. I mean, either we hate it or it finds a way to sneak into our lives, and then it destroys us. Isn't that what Romans 3:23 says? For the wages of sin is what? Death. Now, I think the primary focus there is spiritual death. People are going to be lost forever in eternity. Why? Because of sin. Sin leads to death. It often leads to physical death, but always leads to spiritual death. We need to understand that people are going to be lost eternally, forever, because of sin. That ought to make us hate it with a passion, and hate it as much as God hates it. Hate what is evil. Cling to what's good. Now, it's not enough just to hate evil. We also got to hold on to what's good. And that's our lesson for next week. We're going to take the second part of that verse and look at the fact that not only do I need to hate what's bad, just doing that alone isn't going to be enough. I need to hold on to and cling to what's good. And I'm going to end by asking the question that I think every one of us needs to ask. Do I really hate sin in my life? Do I abhor evil? Do I detest it? Am I horrified by sin? Final verse, Ephesians chapter 5 and verse 3. And I'm going to read it in the NIV because it words it differently. Different twist to it. Paul says to the Ephesians, but among you, he's talking to Christians, but among you Christians, there must not even be a hint. I like that word. Not even a hint of sexual immorality or any kind of impurity or of greed. Don't let there even be a little hint of anything sinful in your life. Why? Because these are improper for God's holy people. Ephesians 5 and verse 3. That verse troubles me because my life is not full of sin. I don't want to live that kind of a life. But the question that God is asking me, Tom, is there even a hint? Is there even a hint of sin in your life? If so, then you need to get rid of it. The question isn't, am I full of sin? Is my life saturated with sin? But do I allow even a hint to be there and not care? Before you do something, ask, is this questionable? Am I sure God would be all right with this? Would Jesus do this with me if he were here right now? Before you say something, you ask the question, is this something that I would hear Jesus say? Before I think something, are these thoughts that God would be all right with? Are they questionable? Is there a hint of sin in what I'm about to say, do, or think? And if so, I need to hate it and get it out of my life. I think if we could take this verse, and I'm not speaking for you, I don't know most of you well enough to really know what's happening in your life, but I know how Satan attacks me. And I know he would be happy if I would have a hint of sin in my life and not care. I encourage you, I plead with you, hate what is evil. Hate sin. Hold on to what's good. If you would turn to the song that's been selected. 839, make sure I have the right one. 839. If you're not a Christian, if you've never made the decision to get out of a life of sin and give your life to God, this would be a great time to make that choice. If you've made that decision and you find your life drifting back to where you used to be, back to that old way, you catch yourself talking, saying things, typing things, thinking things, listening to things that you know God doesn't approve of, using language that God would not be happy with, then use this song as a means to encourage each of us to get back on track, to hate what is evil. You need to respond in any way. Let us know how we can help you as we sing together. Would you stand as we sing?